All right, it is a few minutes after 8, so I think we're going to go ahead and kick off this webinar. Want to thank everybody for joining us today. Again, this is the Minneapolis Regional Chamber's Government Affairs Forum, where we will be discussing ranked choice voting. I'm really excited about a robust conversation and educational one today. My name is Megan Lee Erickson. I am the Vice President of Member Services here with the Minneapolis Regional Chamber. And before we get started and officially kick off, I just want to share a couple of informational items with you. As you noted, when you enter the meeting, all attendees will have their audio and video muted, but that doesn't mean that we don't want to interact with you. So please, please, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your toolbar if you have any questions to be considered for our speakers. You will also be able to communicate with our hosts using the chat feature. So if you have any questions or concerns, you can do that as well. And just so you are aware, this webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording in our post-production email. Today, I want to also, before we get started, thank the lovely, wonderful supporters who make this presentation possible. So I want to thank our sponsors today. We really appreciate your support. Our sponsors for this event are CenterPoint Energy, the Minnesota Timberwolves and Lynx, Minnesota Twins, Mortenson, Target, Wells Fargo Bank, and Xcel Energy. Thank you again to our premier sponsors for your support of this informative programming. And now I'm going to do a brief introduction, just share with you who we have today for our panelists, although our moderator will go into a little bit more detail and you'll learn more about them throughout the program. Joining us today is Jean Massey. She is the Executive Director of Fair Vote Minnesota. We also have Ginny Gelms. She is an elections manager with Hennepin County. And Larry Jacobs, Director of the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota. Thank you again to the three of you for joining us today for this important conversation. At this point, I am going to pass it over to our moderator, Brian McClung. He is the co-CEO and senior principal at Park Street Public, and he will be leading today's conversation. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and I'll hand it off to you, Brian. You can take it from here.
Hey, great. Thanks, Megan. And thanks so much to the Minneapolis Regional Chamber for bringing this forum together. A very timely one with elections coming up here, municipal elections happening around Minnesota in just a couple of months. A lot of interest now. We're in that post-state fair, post-Labor Day zone where Minnesotans turn their attention to the ballot. And so this is a great opportunity for us to talk about ranked choice voting, what it means, how it works, how it's been unfolding, and the future of voting in our state. So thank you to the Minneapolis Chamber for bringing this together, and thank you to our great panelists for agreeing to be part of this. I want to jump right into the conversation because there's a lot to go over in a short amount of time. And so we're just going to do a round robin, Jean and Ginny and Larry, and have each of you kind of start us off by talking about what ranked choice voting is, right? Providing a bit of a 101 for people. Here in Minnesota, it's still relatively new. The first major ranked choice voting election was back in 2009 when the city of Minneapolis moved to ranked choice voting for their mayoral and city council elections. So now we're coming up on the fourth election in Minneapolis under ranked choice voting. St. Paul came in next. And then you've had Duluth and Minnetonka and Bloomington and St. Louis Park join as well. So we have a handful of cities, most of them in Hennepin County, where Ginny oversees the elections process. So she has the most experience from a hands-on perspective in the state in looking at ranked choice voting. So Jean, if you could start us off from the perspective of Fair Vote Minnesota, tell us a little bit about really the origins of ranked choice voting in our state. We know this is a conversation that goes back well before 2009 and that first ranked choice voting election. Tell us a little bit about the impetus behind that, the desire of the supporters of ranked choice voting, what they're looking for, and this experience that we've had, over these past 12 years in Minnesota with ranked choice voting.
Well, thank you, Brian, and thank you, Chamber, for sponsoring this. I agree, timely conversation about ranked choice voting. Fair Vote, I'll just give a little bit of background on Fair Vote Minnesota. We've been an organization that's been around for more than 20 years, and I've been with this process for about a dozen years, starting the conversation in Minneapolis back in 2006 when it was passed on the ballot. There was a lot of interest in the city of Minneapolis, like there has been in cities across the country, on the process of our democracy being more inclusive and being more participatory and diverse in who the voters are and opening that process up. And California really started this new method of voting in the early 2000s in San Francisco and some of the other cities. And Minneapolis began to ask, can we do better too? So essentially what ranked choice voting does is it replaces 2-round elections with a single election. And that really changes the landscape altogether, because holding a runoff like San Francisco did, or a primary like cities do here in Minnesota, is very exclusive. Very few voters turn out for a municipal primary. We're talking somewhere 5 to 10% in a good year would be the turnout in a primary. So ranked choice voting logistically simply rolls the primary into one election in November and brings together the most candidates with the most voters in a single higher turnout election. And what we've seen by putting all the candidates together in a single election, we have much more robust and competitive elections, which drives higher turnout. So we're seeing higher turnout with ranked choice voting, more diverse candidates, more candidates on the ballot, and highly competitive elections for the most part in all of these election cycles. So with that kind of outcome, many more cities became interested in the process. As you said, St. Paul followed Minneapolis, then Bloomington and Minnetonka most recently, and St. Louis Park also uses it. You mentioned Duluth. Duluth decided not to adopt this process. I think there's interest in coming back to that question in Duluth. And there are many, many more cities across the state, including a Rochester and others, that would like to do this, but hold elections in even years where it's more difficult because of ballot conformity laws that restrict how a ballot can look in even years, and they hold elections in even years. So there's great interest across the state and across the country. And here in Minnesota, we have legislation that would provide for a local option. And that local option would allow any city that wishes to use ranked choice voting to do so. And it would then clear up some of the administrative barriers we're seeing for cities that want to do it in even years. Our bill also would expand ranked choice voting for federal and state elections as well, for all of our legislative races, our constitutional races, and for the presidential election. So that legislation is now in place. It's moving forward in the legislature, and we hope to continue to advance that. I'll just mention as well that ranked choice voting is now in use not just in 5 cities in Minnesota this year, but in nearly 30 cities across the country in several states. So it's expanding pretty rapidly in many states in the United States, and in Utah alone, almost 20 cities it will be used. So in red states and blue states, this is of interest as a good tool to expand our democracy at the local level. And now we're seeing states use it too. Both Alaska and Maine are the states that have adopted ranked choice voting, and other states are moving forward as well. So before I kind of hand this over, let me just go through the basics of what ranked choice voting is. And I know Ginny can kind of delve into it in a little bit deeper level in terms of how it's being executed in Hennepin County. So ranked choice voting is the process of allowing voters to rank on the ballot, marking a first choice, second choice, third choice. It really is that straightforward. And as a voter, you simply want to ask, if my first choice doesn't make it through the runoff process, who do I want as a backup? And because we're consolidating 2 elections in one, it's an instant runoff process. We just don't need 2 elections. We just get 1 election to get to a majority winner. So in the tabulation process, all the ballots are tabulated. And if one candidate receives a majority of the vote, then the election's declared and that candidate wins. And we saw that when Mayor Rybak ran in 2009. It was not a highly competitive election. He won on the first ballot. Mayor Carter did as well. But if not, if it's a more split race, then we use the instant runoff process. All the ballot with the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated, and then those ballots are now counted for the second choices on those ballots. And we go through that process until one candidate reaches that winning threshold of a majority of votes in a single seat election. So it's really that simple. More and more voters are understanding it. And exit polling here in Minnesota, and we saw the exit polling in New York City that just used it, the biggest jurisdiction using ranked choice voting in the United States, shows that over 90% of voters find ranked choice voting simple to use, and they rank their preferences. And we see high levels of ranking in all of these elections. So it's working, and voters prefer it and want to see it expanded in other races.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Jean, for that overview. And yeah, you're right. I was thinking of Duluth, that they had considered it, but I guess chose not to. But, you know, a city where they might be looking at that again in the future. And you mentioned Utah and some other places. I think it's interesting that Utah is the leading state in the United States for the use of ranked choice voting, and not a state that comes to mind as, you know, a state with a more, you know, kind of conservative bent overall, you know, a Republican governed states. And yet, because they have passed that local option law that you talked about, many cities there are utilizing ranked choice voting, which is interesting to look at. Ginny, I want to take it over to you and talk about, from your perspective as the Director of Elections for Hennepin County, and previously working with the city of Minneapolis and their elections, and had that experience as ranked choice voting came online. You know, one of the things we were talking about before we started is also kind of understanding and resetting expectations for what election night looks like. You know, with ranked choice voting, it's not going to be, you know, 10 o'clock, the results are all in, drop the balloons, turn off the TV news and go to bed. This is a process that can take a little bit more time. And I think that's, you know, that's tough for people. We've kind of conditioned ourselves to think like, I'm done voting, I want to know who it is. And so tell us a little bit about kind of the logistics, and when, you know, ranked choice voting came online, what you had to establish kind of a new system of tabulating these votes, you know, to make sure things were going well. And of course, in New York City, earlier this year, we saw an experience where they had a problem with this. And that was, you know, an example of where they where they did a test run, and then they used some of those test ballots, and that got folded by accident into the regular ballots. And then you have confusion, and that doesn't help, right? We want people to have faith and trust in those results and in the election process. So tell us a little bit about how all of this comes together at your level, and what, you know, the experience that you've had over this past 12 years or so with ranked choice voting.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. There's a lot there that you teed up for me. So just, you know, I'll briefly say, as you mentioned, I worked for the city of Minneapolis when ranked choice voting was first being implemented. And so I was the project lead on that back in 2009. And then, you know, and then I moved on to Hennepin County. And as we've talked about, there are other cities in Hennepin County that have since come on board with ranked choice voting. So it's a little bit, it's been done a little bit differently in every city that's come on board, just a little bit differently. I'll say, I guess, just overall to your point about kind of expectations and how election night go. I mean, I wish I could go to bed at 10 p.m. on election night. I'm usually up until more like 3 or 4. But yeah, I wish we could put that genie back in the bottle of expecting election results within a couple hours of the close of polls on election night. You know, that's actually never really been realistic. The results that we get on election night, even in traditional elections, are unofficial. And there is an extended process, even in traditional elections, that goes on for, you know, often weeks after election day, of different jurisdictions, you know, finishing tallying ballots in different states. Some states accept ballots after election day in the mail if they're postmarked by election day, getting those ballots in, double checking everything and making sure that everything is correct. And we get into trouble a little bit when the public expects that, you know, everything is one and done on election night. And if there's anything that happens after that, then something is fishy. I think this contributes to a misperception that, you know, the longer it takes for us to come up with official results, that there's something going on that's wrong with the election system. And we're kind of infamous in Minnesota for taking our time and getting it right. You know, I harken back to the Franken-Coleman election that was historically close. And we had a quite extensive, long recount for that election. And then, of course, that got kicked to the courts, which took much longer. But there is a value in taking our time and getting it right. And so ranked choice voting does, because it's more complicated to administer, because it's more complicated to count, and because it's sort of specialized technology in order to count. It does add some time in order in coming up with results. Now, Minneapolis, which has had the longest span of experience in this state, has gotten faster over time at producing their official results. Our first election, when I was there in 2009, boy, I sat in that warehouse helping to calculate results for well over a week. I think it might have been closer to 2 weeks, actually. But then by 2017, which was the last election that they ran with ranked choice voting, they were able to finish up the results by Wednesday evening, which the Wednesday after election day. So they've gotten much faster. Eager to see what they do this year, how quickly they're able to do that. But some of that came from some technology advances that we have had in the interim, and also some process changes that Minneapolis has made over time. They've learned over time what works, what's more efficient, and they've actually made some changes to their ordinance and to their charter that sort of facilitate being able to call results for certain elections sooner than they would otherwise be able to do. So that's a little bit around sort of the timing of results for the elections. And then you had one other thing that I wanted to get to just briefly before you kick it over to opening comments from Larry, which again is this technology piece. And that's really where Hennepin County is kind of our biggest role in the ranked choice voting operations these days, because it is up to each city to sort of decide as a policy matter what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. And it is up only for local elections at this point. And the way that Hennepin County supports cities is by we own, we maintain, we test, we program all of the voting equipment that counts the ballots. And we also do the ballot layout because it's all part of the same system that produces those ballots, that prints those ballots, and that ultimately counts the ballots and provides those results on election night. So the technology that we have was not initially designed with ranked choice voting in mind, but we've been able to work with our vendor, which is Election Systems and Software, by the way. That's been the Hennepin County voting equipment vendor for some time. We've been able to work with the vendor to get some sort of add-ons to their federally and state certified election equipment package that allow the county to get additional data about the ballots that's needed in order to calculate the winners in a ranked choice voting election. Because in a traditional election, basically all we need to know, let's say you have, 3 candidates who are running for mayor in a city, we just need to know the total number of votes for each of those candidates citywide. That's it. It's pretty simple. That kind of data is transmitted to us actually on election night electronically. So that's why we're able to provide those unofficial results pretty quick for traditional election. For ranked choice voting election, we need more data than that in order for the city to be able to calculate who the winner was in a ranked choice voting election. We need to know more than just the total number of votes. We need to know how many votes each candidate got and how they were ranked and in what order they were ranked in each ballot. And that's a lot more complicated. That data cannot come to us electronically on election night. So what happens is in the cities that have this, we get the physical memory sticks from those ballot counters on election night at the county. Those come to the county. We aggregate, we download the data from all of those memory sticks into our secure system. And we produce a file that we then are able to get back to the city that has that detailed ballot information that the city then takes and uses to figure out the winners. The city takes it from there. But that even just that process of getting that data and collecting all that data and aggregating it to give that file to the city, that is a night-long process. That alone takes us to the next morning. So the technology is a little bit more cumbersome than with the traditional election. There have been gains over time. I suspect that the next time we go out to purchase new voting equipment, which would be after the 2024 election, remains to be seen what year precisely Hennepin County will need to purchase new equipment, but not before the next presidential election. It's likely that we'll have some voting equipment available on the market that will have a little bit more flexibility for us with regard to ranked choice voting. And if we have legislation at the state legislature that's passed that enables some statewide sort of standards about what ranked choice voting means and how it should work and what the algorithm is for any city that passes it, that will help us as well to have that standard, because what we're looking at right now is kind of voting system vendors are trying to hit these different targets. They're kind of limited. They're in different. It's a little bit different in every area that does it. That makes it difficult for vendors to come up with a solution that they can sell in a lot of jurisdictions. So I'll leave it at that for now. I could go on for hours, but I'll leave it there for now.
That's a lot. No, thank you, Jenny. Really appreciate that. And Professor Jacobs, from the perspective of a political scientist, this has to be very fascinating, because my impression is that Americans are very reluctant to change how they vote, right? We sort of have just had this, mindset since the 1700s of, right, it's like, pick your person and whoever gets the most wins, and that's it. And so exploring these different ways of holding elections seems really fascinating. It feels like the proponents are primarily focused, like Jean was talking about, on increasing turnout as part of this and trying to use this as a tool to increase turnout, increasing the diversity of candidates on the ballot, having more different types of candidates engaged. And I would also say add in a third one, which is the expectation that this results in kinder and gentler elections. That if you're running for office and at the same time in the back of your head, you want to be somebody's second choice or third choice so that you can pick up those votes later, that you may be less likely to go negative on the other candidates. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on, as you've watched ranked choice voting play out, if those three things seem to be happening and kind of what the outlook is for this going forward.
Thank you, Brian. Those are all excellent points, and I want to pick up on them. I want to start, though, more broadly, which is we have a pattern now in which candidates that lose blame the election officials. They talk about fraud, they talk about stolen elections. Obviously, we're thinking Donald Trump, but if you go back to 2016, there were Democrats, not as many, and it didn't spread to as many members of the public, but you did have Democrats also crying fraud. This is a real problem, and I want to tell you that Ginny Gilms is one of the frontline heroes in our democracy. And yeah, she could have gone on for a lot longer, because the steps that Ginny is taking to make sure that the elections are secure and fair and that only legitimate ballots are cast and counted are extensive. And that is the case around the country. I am most struck when I think about elections, even in 2020, how few actual election officials from either party have come out and denounced it. Look at Georgia, where you had a Republican elected Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, who voted for Donald Trump and yet stuck to the rules and the laws and the procedures. And that's what I know about election officials. And Ginny is one of the best that we have in the country. And I think we all owe her our appreciation. I want to start with a slightly broader frame here. I'm just finished a book, it come out in March, about the history of American democracy. And a lot of it is about the reforms that have been passed in the 19th century, the 20th century. And one of the patterns that we see again and again is intense disappointment, frustration with American democracy. Again and again, we've heard actually some of the same language we hear today about American democracy is dying or shriveling or and so forth. And then there's a reform movement, earnest, well-meaning, to change it. Sometimes it's worked out, but other times not so much. Look at the direct primary when it was introduced about 100 years ago. A lot of enthusiasm. This was going to save our democracy. And there was a smart group of people who said, wait a second. And they anticipated, though over time they were sidelined, that the primaries would put power in the hands of a relatively small number who would tend to favor candidates who are divisive and extreme. That was anticipated a century ago, and many of us who study elections, nonpartisan, worry about the primary bringing down the gatekeeper function that we need in a representative democracy. So let me get to ranked choice voting. And I agree with Brian. I think one of the real accomplishments of ranked choice voting, as it's responded to widespread frustration with our democracy today, one of the real accomplishments has been to incentivize civility. If you are running in a ranked choice system and you're a candidate, then you want to make sure that you're not alienating voters, because you need voters who are going to rank you second or third. And if you run, a campaign that is oriented to, let's say, anti-vaccines, which is, if you look at the polls, it's polarizing. You got some people who are very, very strong about it, and then, a plurality, maybe even a majority, who are supportive of vaccine. If you look on the left, if you're running in the primary as a Democrat, you might run on single payer. It's very popular among progressives. And those are the incentives in our normal system, particularly with primaries. But ranked choice voting begins to shift that, because you need to be putting yourself in the mindset, how do I win over those second or third place voters? That's important, and I think that's a contribution. But let's be precise about what ranked choice voting is. Let's put aside the kind of the hopes. And there's a lot of talk about expanding democracy, expanding the number of people participating, expanding the diversity of the electorate, making it more inclusive. And for those of us who are data people, and that's what I am, I'm a data person. I've published 17 books and over 100 articles, and most of them are data-oriented, math. And what we see, both in my research, but going back more than half a century, is a pattern. Now, the jargon of it is SES Gradient. And what that means is social and economic status differences. And it won't surprise you to know that if you're better educated, if you have higher income, and if you're white, we tend to see higher turnout. We tend to see much more attention to the details and the information in an election. So if you had, let's say, 10 candidates, you'd expect an SES gradient. That is, that you had those who were more affluent, better educated, and white, who would be more apt, not everybody, this is a generalization, more apt to know those candidates, know their issues, know something about the issues, and be more accurate in connecting your preferences about those issues with the candidates. This is political science 101. And we know this, again, half a century. The question is, how does ranked choice voting fit into that? And there's been some, I would say that's a preliminary stage. We need a lot more, but there have been studies. One study by Minnesotan David Schultz and Christy Rendall for the Minneapolis Elections Department found that those who were more likely to rank candidates were older, better educated, white, and wealthier. Now, that is important data, not surprising to political scientists. This is entirely expected. It is the SES gradient. There's a study done in San Francisco of the ranked choice voting, which finds very similar pattern. And I've done a study with a former colleague, Joanne Miller, which also finds a very similar pattern in Minneapolis elections, where we found that those who were better, had higher income and white, were more likely to turn out, more likely to complete their ballot accurately, which is an important element, and more likely to use all three opportunities to rank candidates. So what does that mean? That means if you are middle or lower income, if you are not white, if you're less well educated, then you're less likely to do those things. You may be filling out, you may not be showing up because you find it too confusing. You may not understand what is going on or understand the candidates and their distinct positions. And you may not use all the opportunities to cast the ballot. Put another way, it's possible, and again, I think we need more study here. It's possible that this SES gradient that we've known about for so long, and which appears in every election, that it's actually multiplied by ranked choice voting. Because if you have these attributes that mean you're going to participate more, that you're going to be more accurate and understand the issues and connect them to the candidates and fill out all three, you're going to have those greater advantages. You're going to fill out 3 candidate preferences, whereas someone who doesn't have those attributes may only fill out 1. So I don't say this in any way as it's not a put down, a reform. It's just we have a history in America of getting very enthusiastic, of being vague about what it is that's actually being done, of kind of sidelining the people who are saying, wait a second here, is this actually what is being promised? And I would suggest a bit more caution, a bit more thoughtfulness. Let's put our thinking caps on about ranked choice voting. It may not be what we think it is.
Well, yeah, thanks, Larry. That's a good segue to the first question that we got here in the Q&A. And again, we want you all of the participants, excuse me, to join in the conversation. So please use the Q&A feature. And as you hear from our panelists, there's a lot to unpack in this conversation. This is a really interesting and yet kind of complex issue. And there's a lot to it. And so we want to hear, your thoughts, your experience with ranked choice voting, et cetera. And so this first question that we received from Debbie, she says, I've read recent studies that show ranked choice voting disenfranchises BIPOC and immigrant communities, and that they're less likely to vote for more than one candidate. How are we addressing this issue? So Jean, we'll start off with you on that topic. And as Larry said, Professor Schultz and others have looked at this topic as well. And of course, this is a relatively new change in our voting process here in these last 12 years in Minneapolis, and more recently in some other cities here in Hennepin County. So tell us a little bit about this issue and concern of people not knowing. And really, if you only vote for one candidate when you have the opportunity to vote for 3, if your candidate doesn't make the cut, now your vote isn't counted. And so that's a disservice to folks. And so we want people to fully participate if they're going to be engaged in this. So tell us a little bit about this part of the conversation around BIPOC and immigrant communities.
Sure, and we hear that concern a lot. The good news is Professor Jacobs had referred to some studies that were done immediately following the first election in Minneapolis, which was a first test out of the gate. Since then, the whole process has come a long way, and we're now in our 4th cycle in Minneapolis, and cities in Minnesota and across the country have more experience with this. All the exit polling shows that regardless of race and ethnicity, age, income, voters are ranking. And so the idea that people of color aren't ranking their ballots in equal numbers simply isn't proving true at this point. And in fact, in the recent Berkeley election in 20, people of color, the Asian American community and Latino community tended to rank their ballot more than the white population did. There is every incentive for every voter to rank their ballot, and there needs to be, of course, education around that process, but we are seeing nearly equal rates of ranking across those population groups, and more studies are showing that. People of color, frankly, find it quite insulting to suggest that they're not ranking their ballot and don't understand how to do that. What we're seeing ranked choice voting do positively for diverse communities is giving the opportunity for more diverse candidates to run and to win. And that is capturing the attention of communities of color, engaging them in the process, turning out more communities of color to the polls, and they are ranking their ballot. And we can see that in the election outcomes in Minneapolis and elsewhere, where we see competitive elections that go to the runoff process. And candidates are emerging with more than 50% of the initial votes cast. That means that voters are ranking. That exhausted ballot rate is not very high. So that shows that voters in wards that are predominantly wards of color, voters are ranking their ballot. And New York City is probably the biggest test example of how engaging the communities are around the ranking process. There was good voter education. Candidates were asking voters not just for their first choice, but their second choice and their third choice as well. And nearly 90% of the voters ranked their ballot. So we're seeing that the whole idea that there's such disparity between people of color and white voters under ranked choice voting not proven true.
You know, one thing that was interesting about that New York City primary was near the end of the race, when two of the candidates essentially formed a public alliance and said, we want you to, vote for me, but if, for your second choice vote, I encourage you to vote for this other candidate. I don't know that we've seen that happen in Minnesota, but maybe, Jean, you can tell us a little bit about that from a strategy perspective, or your colleagues that work on ranked choice voting in other states. Is that something that is becoming more common? I guess that also ties in with this civility issue that we were talking about, that you're trying to run maybe a more positive race, and certainly in that case, where you're actually partnering up with another candidate. I thought that was an interesting outcome.
I think that kind of candidate behavior certainly is happening in races in Minnesota. We saw it in the mayor's race in St. Paul in 2017. We're seeing it in the mayor's race right now among candidates in Minneapolis mayor's race, and in some of the council races as well. We're seeing quite a robust coalition building between certain candidates, not across the board, but certainly in some of those races. So that is happening. And we've seen in Maine, where ranked choice voting is used at a statewide level, candidates coalescing and going on TV and coalescing together. Vote for me, number one, and vote for her, number two. And then the other person saying just the opposite. If you vote for me, one, and vote for her, two. So that kind of explicit coalition building among candidates is happening. And what we're seeing too is that voters, it's not always the case where you need to formally coalesce with another candidate in order to build that broad coalition. As a candidate, what you need to do is to be expansive in who you're reaching out to for voters and building that broad coalition of support. And in that process, as Professor Jacobs has said, you really don't want to alienate other voters. And the idea that you need to build a big coalition to win, and you need to keep that coalition together in order to get reelected. That's why we believe it holds the promise of depolarizing our politics in America. Right now, under the plurality system, you can run many candidates and the candidate with the most votes can win. And when that happens, and that's some 30% of the vote or 40% of the vote, that means the vast majority of voters did not make that decision to elect that candidate. And candidates who win under that scenario tend to govern more to their base. So this provides us with an opportunity to elect candidates with broad support who are then needing to be responsive to that broader coalition just to get reelected and to stay in office. So it holds the promise for better governance.
And Jenny, I have a question about, as you've tabulated these races and looked at the numbers as they come in, it still would appear that there are very few cases where a candidate is in second place on the initial count and overtakes the leading candidate as a result of those second and third choice votes coming their way. So maybe tell us a little bit about just that kind of numbers perspective. It still appears that really, the front runner after you do the first round, in almost every case, ends up winning the election. I think we saw one or two city council races. I think Steve Fletcher comes to mind, where I think he was in second place on the initial count and then ended up winning his city council race. But tell us a little bit about what you see in terms of candidates actually overcoming a disadvantage with those additional votes.
I mean, I think you summed it up, Brian. Typically, in most cases, we do see that the candidate who has the most first choice votes goes on to win, and there are. And also, it's very common to see that the election is actually determined in the first round, so that we don't actually end up having to do that. The candidate is frequently able to get more than 50% of the first choice votes. That doesn't, but again, I'm not here as a policy person, just as an administrator. But I would make a point that I'm not sure that that the infrequency with which we see scenarios where a candidate does not have the most first choice votes and then goes on to win. I'm not sure that that means much on either side. I'm not sure if that means that necessarily means that ranked choice voting is a waste of time. I also, another argument you could make is that, oh, well, do we really want that? Are we really comfortable with seeing a candidate go on to win an election if they don't have like the majority of the first choice votes? Or the plurality rather of the first choice votes. So, but I would, if you don't mind, Brian, I would like to go back to this question about BIPOC communities, particularly because that question, I believe, came from one of my policymakers, Hennepin County Commissioner. So I feel a need to address it. And I'll just say that from the county perspective in Hennepin County, this is a really interesting thing for us to manage because, again, it's individual cities within the county that have this system, and as long as it remains sort of a city issue at the county level, there are some things that we just are not really involved in, and so it really does at this point, again, until we have some enabling legislation at the state level or until the system is expanded. The cities are kind of, and again, this is coming from an administrative perspective, the cities are a little bit on their own in terms of how to reach out to their voters, how to engage their voters, how to make sure that they are engaging all of their voters and that they are helping voters overcome these barriers to participation that particularly hit historically marginalized communities with regard to ranked choice voting. And as I heard, there's a live debate around how much that actually does happen. I will say that at the county level, what we try to focus on, and this is really important to us, this is really important to our policymakers, and we have made more strides in addressing the disparities in voter engagement and participation over time, but we still have a lot of work to do. I feel very grateful that I have supportive policymakers who have in the past and who continue to invest in giving us resources to expand our voter engagement and education program. And we have had to take a hard look at how we do that and understand that kind of the old rote system of just, well, we'll just send a mail piece to everybody in the county. That doesn't work. That doesn't get voters where they're at. And I think there's some interesting discussion to be had around, okay, so, Professor Jacobs is coming in with this data, and then there's also a question of, all right, well, what is contributing to the landscape looking the way that it is? We're not sure. So one thing that we have done just across the board, this is not specific to ranked choice voting, but across the board, we at Hennepin County Elections have started to try to make inroads in having conversations with our voters to try to understand better what are the barriers for them. Is it that they need education, or is it that they need childcare? Is it that they need, just time to be able to go to the polls? Is it, we have voters with disabilities? Is standing in line a burden that falls disproportionately on some folks who have physical disabilities, for example? And we're expanding in Minnesota, aside from ranked choice voting, we're expanding, and we have been expanding the ways that people can participate and making it easier for folks to participate over time. The explosion of absentee voting in this state is a part of that. Was helped is a weird word, but was helped by the pandemic, the fact that we had this public health crisis, and so we needed to invest very strongly in sending people ballots through the mail, and that's a whole other conversation. But I think overall, the trend in Minnesota, and I'm very grateful for this, that we have this culture here and that we have policymakers who by and large support this, definitely in Hennepin County, is increasing the ways that people can participate, and that gives us administrators more tools to offer voters who do have additional barriers to participation. But at the county level, we kind of have to focus on voter registration. And until we have kind of a broader system around ranked choice voting, it's going to be the cities out there on their own trying to forge their own path around that.
Brian, if I might, could I just add on to what Ginny said? One, kudos to the cities that are implementing ranked choice voting for really stepping up, and with the county's help. They've all invested in new voter outreach and education campaigns during these election cycles. And while it starts because there's a new process underway that needs education, they continue with that function in every election cycle. And I'm a big proponent of seeing our public election bodies really doing a much more robust education process, which now largely falls on candidates and campaigns to do. And they now so target voters. It's one of the problems complicating turnout is that campaigns target voters and don't care if the other voters turn out. Well, of course, under ranked choice voting, they need to go after more voters, and so that certainly helps. But the public election officials really, their role in helping people understand that when there's an election, here's who's on the ballot, and here are the dates for election, that helps enormously. And I'm grateful that they've stepped up and really are playing a bigger role in doing that. At Fair Vote Minnesota, we do a lot of education as well at the grassroots level in these election cycles, and that helps, but it can't replace what the cities can do. And then I just wanted to clarify on the candidate coming in second place, ultimately becoming the winner. That is the whole point of ranked choice voting, is to ensure we know who the majority of the voters prefer. Like, that's the point. Remember that we used to do that in 2 rounds. We had a primary. That nonpartisan primary would narrow the field to 2. And that would be a summer primary, again, very low turnout, adding an expense to the cities that ran them. And if the candidate in second place in that primary went on to become the winner in the general, no one asked any questions. It was just because we forgot who won that primary. But when it's consolidated in a single election, it's very easy to see who did top out in the first round, but wasn't expansive enough in their support to win a majority of the vote in that runoff process. But again, all we're doing is replacing what used to be 2 elections now in 1, and we have the same phenomenon happening before as we do now. It doesn't happen often, as you said, but it can happen. And that's the point of doing any kind of runoff process, is to ensure we know where the voters really are and who they want.
Right. Well, Professor Jacobs, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to just echo what Jean just said about what Ginny is doing. I think, and that's why I was giving her a shout out earlier. I think what Minneapolis is doing in Hennepin County, it's the way it should be done. But I do want to push back a little on Jean. Remember, she's a professional advocate. Her job here today and around the state is to give us a sell. I don't have anything to sell. I'm just like an academic who does research, and my preference is on the one hand, on the other hand. But I do think, and I'll just add this, we need a bit more caution here. The questions that's been raised about the impact of ranked choice voting on voters of color are legitimate. And the idea that we've been around, had a number of rounds of voting, 4 rounds. In Minneapolis, it's disappeared. It's just nonsense. I haven't seen that data. And the data I have seen, I don't read in the kind of glorious way that Jean Massey does. I think the issue about this Ses Gradient, which is like the iron, it's like gravity for political scientists. It never goes away. It's always there. And the potential that that ranked choice voting is intensifying it, accelerating it, is there. Now, is it a done case? No. And I would not be kind of speaking in certainties at all. I think there's a lot of uncertainty about that. And I think the kinds of thing that Ginny is talking about are some of the ways in which you can chip away at it. But it is a reality, and I don't think we can wish it away. And I would just say to folks who are thinking about ranked choice voting, be thoughtful about it. It is not the kind of delivery of democracy that's being promised. And we have like a 250-year history of going for the bright, shiny thing and thinking this is the cure for democracy, and then discovering a decade or 2 decades later, wait a second, it's created these other problems. And so I'm cautious, I'm hopeful, but I am cautious.
So Larry, then in your research and looking at the data, are there other election reforms? I mean, as we look more broadly at what some other states are doing, and Jeannie points out the problem with primaries of low turnout, but California, for example, has gone to the top 2, move forward regardless of party. And what we're talking about with ranked choice voting in Minnesota, these are all nonpartisan elections, right? These are, municipal elections for mayor. There's no party on the ballot. So how do we translate, some of those desires into partisan elections? And, are there reforms that we've seen that actually do the good things, increase turnout, increase diversity, but also don't have these negative potential impacts of, suppressing BIPOC votes, et cetera?
And a lot of us are interested in what California is doing, kind of top two or nonpartisan primaries. And what that means is you have a primary, all the parties are in it. And then the top two candidates go into the general election. And in some of the congressional races and other races, you've seen two Democrats or two Republicans facing off against each other. And, I would say theoretically, it should introduce a bit more moderation because you're competing for, that undecided centrist voter. The evidence is not in on that. And I could give you two studies that say, yeah, it does that, and two studies that say it doesn't. So, unfortunately, I'm not the bearer of good news in terms of saying, here is the alternative that is the replacement. And, as Jean said, ranked choice voting is hot. It is being picked up around the country. And I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying, be thoughtful about it. Be cautious. Be someone, like Ginny Gelms, who's studying like, okay, Professor Jacobs has found these issues. What can we do about it? And I applaud her and others around the country who are putting in that kind of thought. I'm just because I've read so much about these passionate advocates who say, we found it. I'm just not that keen about shutting off the thinking machine. I think we need to be cautious. We need to have conversations about it. And that's good.
Yeah, and Jean, tell us about that experience. Like, for example, in Maine, they have extended it, I think, to congressional races and others. Maybe they're extending it to their governor's race coming up next year too. I'm not sure if they did it there, but curious to hear just thoughts about, outside of these municipal nonpartisan elections that we're talking about, maybe just some examples of what you've seen, in other states that are moving into those types of races.
And before I do that, I just wanted to say there is a lot of new data about voter participation in the ranked choice voting process. And I'm just going to make sure you have all of that and viewers can see some of the more extensive research that's out there. And there is a group through New America that's curating a whole lot of deeper research around the experience of ranked choice voting to follow as we move forward. These are key questions and they're important to continue to evaluate as this expands. Again, ranked choice voting is simply the idea that it's a runoff, but it's instant. And we do runoffs to ensure candidates have the broadest support possible. That's what voters are wanting out of our democracy. The experience in Maine has been very helpful for us to see. It's just one state, so of course we want to see more and more experience, but it's working just the way it should. The first election in 2018 was used in the congressional races. Maine has a constitutional barrier to use for the governor's race in the general election, so it's only used in the primary for governor. So that's why you didn't see it in the governor's race. And in 2018, we saw it in the congressional race. So in one of the congressional races, the second congressional race, there were two independent party candidates and a Republican and a Democrat. And it was a race that went to a runoff. I believe the Republican had won the most first choice votes, and then the Democrat won in the runoff process. So we're seeing it play out. Fast forward to 2020, we saw Senator, sorry, her name's escaping me, but she won a majority in the first round election. It was a runoff process, but she won a majority of votes as a popular incumbent in Maine, the Republican. And so again, it worked just the way it should have. Alaska is the second state to have passed ranked choice voting, and both of those were by ballot measures. They combined it with a nonpartisan open primary that you were just talking about. But rather than limiting that open primary to just two candidates, it goes to 4 candidates. So the top 4 candidates in that open nonpartisan primary will then advance to the general election, and it'll be a ranked ballot in the general election.
Oh, and then they'll rank among those 4 in the
That's
general
right.
election.
So I think there is growing interest in the open primary idea. because of how polarizing our primaries have gotten. That model is not the model in the legislation in Minnesota. We would use ranked choice voting in the primary in Minnesota, so that if you have a competitive governor's race in the Republican side or the Democratic side, ranked choice voting would determine the majority winner in that round. And then in the general election, it would be used across the party so that we would eliminate the spoiler dynamic, importantly, because that's become a big barrier. We saw that play out quite a bit in 2020 in several legislative races, where now with the marijuana party having two parties on the ballot in many races, they're splitting the vote, and then winners are winning without a majority of the vote.
Interesting.
I know
Professor
that we're
Jacobs,
coming up against time here,
Ginny,
Brian, but I do want to jump in on this question about going to like statewide offices or congressional districts in Minnesota. And this is, again, not to say that I am taking a policy position on that, but I do have a question about, I'm not as familiar with how statewide elections are administered in Maine. I know a little bit about Alaska, and one thing that folks who are on the webinar should know is that elections administration varies quite widely from state to state. A lot of what we do is laid out in state statute. There are some federal laws, some famous ones, but most of it is done state to state. And so that leads to a lot of variance. I know that Alaska has a lot more centralized administration, that the state government actually does a lot more than say in Minnesota, where it's a much more decentralized model where counties and cities are responsible for a lot of things. So one question that I still have is if we went to ranked choice voting for statewide elections, just administratively how it would work, because what we would need to do would be to collate all of the ballot data from all of the communities that are in whatever jurisdiction where that race is. And I know that there are some technological solutions out there that exist. I'm not sure if any, in fact, I think I can say none of them would currently work with Minnesota's current certification process for elections technology, which isn't to say those things can't be overcome, but that to me as an administrator would be a big thing we would want to make sure we got right and had a good system for getting all of that data together. And again, that's going to create some additional complications. And if you're watching like I am, if you're a super elections nerd, and probably some of the people who are on the webinar are, if you watch late on into the night on election night in the different counties in Minnesota and how late they come in, you'll notice, I'll toot my own horn, Hennepin County comes in pretty quick. We get some counties up in the Arrowhead, it's like way, it's the next day. It's like early wee hours the next day. So those kind of not disparities, but those differences in the way that the administration works across the state, I think would complicate our ability to do a statewide election. Again, not to say it's not possible, but I would be a strong advocate for trying to figure that out before we went to that system, just to make sure that we could have as smooth an election process as possible. And I know that Jean shares that value, so we want to make sure. I
certainly do, of course. Yeah. And I think places like Maine really hold examples that we can follow in terms of how they've taken it statewide. But any kind of change in election requires a revamping of what those rules are. And what I think we saw last year when the state went quickly to a mailed-in balloting process shows just how expedient, efficient, and transparent, and effective our system is through officials like Ginny Gelms in implementing some significant change.
That's great. Well, we're at time. I think I'm supposed to kick it back over to Megan maybe for some wrap-up thoughts. But want to thank our panelists for a great conversation. As you all can tell, that we could go on for another hour or two. There's really a lot here. So we encourage you to do more research and, of course, to vote this fall. And if you're in a place where it's new ranked choice voting like Bloomington, study up, learn the issues, and get out there and encourage your friends and neighbors to be a part of this election. So Jean and Ginny and to Professor Jacobs, we thank you for your thoughts here today. This was really a great discussion. And thanks again to the Minneapolis Regional Chamber for hosting. And I'll toss it over to Megan.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. And in classic live webinar, my dog might make a noise in the background, so I apologize for that in advance. Thanks for the robust conversation today. We will be sending out as much information as we can with links for our listeners and audience attendees today to follow up and make their informed, continue to inform on this very important issue. But I appreciate the robust conversations here today. So thank you. Again, want to thank all of our sponsors for making this possible. And also just want to do a quick plug at the Minneapolis Regional Chamber. We are doing a combination of in-person, hybrid, and still virtual events in the upcoming future. We're in a very busy season, especially as we go into this election cycle. So if you're interested in learning more, we will follow up with a couple of specific plugs. Next week, Monday, there's an Executive Women's Council with a guest speaker. And the conversation is around time management to mind management, strategies for more productive life. That is on Monday, the 20th. That is an in-person event here in the Twin Cities. On Friday, September 24th, we will have a legislative breakfast and public policy conversation around a retail industry update, knowing that that has been really impacted in the past year. That will also be in person on Friday, September 24th. And then just want to also do a quick plug to save the date for those of you interested in our Keystone celebration. We have an annual Keystone Luncheon that will be a hybrid event on December 9th. So that will be coming up later in the year. Thanks again to everyone for participating today. Thank you to our sponsors. Appreciate this conversation and thoughtful dialogue, and look forward to learning more. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll hope to see you soon. Take care.